The old community center on Maple Street had seen better days. Paint peeled from its walls like autumn leaves, and the fluorescent lights flickered with the rhythm of an old man's heartbeat. But for 17-year-old Lily Rodriguez, this place was more than just a building with cracked windows and squeaky doors. It was her refuge from a world that seemed to have no room for dreams like hers. Lily wiped down the last table at Corner Cafe, her part-time job that helped keep food on the table at home. Her mother worked double shifts at the local factory and money was always tight. Every dollar Lily earned went straight to rent, groceries, or her little brother's school supplies. There was never anything left over for the things other kids took for granted: music lessons, fancy clothes, or even a decent phone that didn't crash every time she tried to watch a video. The walk from the cafe to the community center took exactly 12 minutes. Lily knew because she had timed it countless times, rushing between work and the free after-school program where she helped younger kids with their homework. The community center was one of the few places in their neighborhood where teenagers could hang out without spending money they didn't have. As she pushed through the heavy glass doors, the familiar smell of old carpet and cleaning supplies greeted her. The main room was mostly empty except for a few kids playing on the donated gaming console that only worked half the time. But Lily's attention, as always, was drawn to the corner where an old upright piano sat against the wall like a forgotten treasure. The piano was probably older than her mother, with scratches on its dark wood surface and keys that had turned slightly yellow with age. Someone had donated it years ago, and most people ignored it completely. Sometimes a little kid would bang on the keys randomly, creating more noise than music, but that was about all the attention it ever got. Lily had been fascinated by that piano since the first day. She'd walked into the community center 3 years ago. She would steal glances at it while helping kids with math problems or organizing game nights. There was something about it that called to her, like it was waiting for someone to unlock the music sleeping inside. At home, their small apartment had barely enough room for the basics. Her mother slept on the couch so Lily and her 8-year-old brother Tommy could share the tiny bedroom. There was no space for luxuries like musical instruments, even if they could afford one. When Lily was younger, she used to draw piano keys on pieces of cardboard and pretend to play, moving her fingers like she had seen pianists do in movies. Her fascination with music had started by accident. When she was 14, a broken laptop at school had been playing a classical piece on repeat because the speakers were stuck. While other students complained about the noise, Lily found herself completely mesmerized by the flowing melody. She asked the teacher what it was and learned it was something called Chopin. That night, she spent hours at the public library, reading everything she could find about piano music. The library became her secret music school. She checked out books about music theory, biographies of famous pianists, and even old sheet music that she studied like textbooks. She memorized the positions of notes on the staff and learned about scales and chords. Her favorite discovery was the library's old computer with internet access, where she could watch piano performances on video sites. Lily spent countless hours watching fingers dance across piano keys, studying every movement, every expression. She watched beginners struggling through simple songs and masters performing pieces that seemed impossible. She began to notice patterns in how pianists moved their hands, how they sat at the bench, even how they breathed while playing. Her mother didn't understand this obsession. Carmen Rodriguez was a practical woman who had learned early in life that dreams were luxuries poor people couldn't afford. She wanted Lily to focus on her studies, graduate high school, and find a steady job with benefits. Music was fine as a hobby, but it wasn't going to pay bills or put food on the table. "You need to be realistic, Mia," her mother would say when she caught Lily drawing piano keys or reading music books. "People like us don't become musicians. We work hard, we provide for our families, and we don't chase fantasies that will only break our hearts." But Lily couldn't stop the music that played constantly in her head. She would tap out rhythms on her desk at school, much to her teacher's annoyance. She practiced finger exercises while walking to work, moving her hands like she was playing invisible keys. At night, lying in the bed she shared with Tommy, she would close her eyes and imagine herself at a piano, playing the beautiful pieces she had memorized from her library sessions. The community center piano became the center of her secret world. During quiet moments when no one was paying attention, she would sit nearby and study it. She noticed which keys looked more worn than others, suggesting they were part of common chords. She observed how the pedals were positioned and wondered what each one did. She even learned to read the faded brand name on the front panel and researched the company online. Some evenings, when the center was nearly empty and she was waiting for her mother to pick her up after work, Lily would approach the piano bench. She never actually touched the keys that felt too bold, too presumptuous. But she would sit on the bench and place her hands in position over the keyboard, feeling the weight of her arms and the curve of her fingers. She would imagine the music flowing from her hands, the way she had seen in hundreds of videos. Other kids at school had their own escapes. Some played sports, others were into art or drama. A few lucky ones had parents who could afford music lessons or instruments. But Lily's escape existed only in her imagination and in the quiet moments she stole with the silent piano. The irony wasn't lost on her that she probably knew more about piano music than some kids who actually took lessons. She could identify pieces by their opening notes, knew the difference between various composers' styles, and understood complex musical concepts that she had taught herself through pure determination. But all of that knowledge felt useless without the ability to actually play. Her friend Miguel often teased her about her fascination with the old piano. "Why don't you just try playing it?" he would ask. "It's not like it's going to bite you." But Lily couldn't explain the fear that held her back. What if she touched those keys and discovered that all her studying and dreaming meant nothing? What if her hands couldn't create the music that lived so vividly in her mind? There was also the matter of other people's reactions. She had overheard comments from classmates about people who didn't know their place or who had ideas above their station. The community center was used by kids from all different backgrounds, including some whose parents could afford private music lessons. What would they think if the girl who served them coffee at the cafe presumed to touch their world? So Lily continued her silent relationship with the piano, learning everything she could while never crossing the line from observer to participant. She told herself that someday, when the time was right, when she was ready, when she was alone, she would finally reach out and touch those keys. But that someday always seemed safely in the future, a distant dream that couldn't hurt her as long as it remained just that, a dream. The public library on 5th Street became Lily's second home during her junior year of high school. Every Tuesday and Thursday, after her shift at the cafe, she would walk the 6 blocks to the old brick building that housed more dreams than she had ever imagined possible. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Patterson, had grown used to seeing the quiet teenager with paint-stained sneakers settle into the same corner table with a stack of music books. Lily's routine was always the same. First, she would check out any new music theory books that had arrived. Then she would claim one of the 3 computers that had internet access and spend exactly 2 hours watching piano performances online. She had to be careful about her time because other people needed the computers too, and she never wanted to seem greedy or draw unwanted attention to herself. Her notebook, a cheap spiral-bound thing she had bought at the dollar store, was filled with her careful handwriting. She copied down musical terms, drew treble and bass clefs until they were perfect, and wrote out scales in every key she could find information about. The margins were crowded with her observations about different pianists' techniques and her attempts to understand why certain pieces moved her to tears while others left her cold. The first piece that had truly captured her heart was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. She had discovered it by accident while watching a documentary about classical music that someone had left playing on one of the library computers. The way the melody seemed to float above the accompaniment, like a conversation between 2 old friends, spoke to something deep inside her that she couldn't name. From that moment, Lily became obsessed with understanding how music worked. She learned that Chopin was Polish, that he had small hands like hers, and that many of his pieces were written for students rather than concert virtuosos. This gave her hope that maybe, just maybe, the music wasn't as impossible as it seemed. She studied his fingering suggestions in the sheet music. Though she had never felt those patterns under her own hands. At home, the contrast between her musical studies and her reality was stark. Their apartment building was old and thin-walled, so she could hear Mrs. Garcia's television through the wall and the upstairs neighbor's baby crying at all hours. Her little brother Tommy was going through a phase where he only wanted to listen to the same pop song on repeat, played through his tablet at maximum volume. When Lily tried to study her music books at the kitchen table, the chaos around her made it nearly impossible to concentrate. Her mother noticed the growing stack of library books and wasn't pleased. Carmen worked 10-hour days at the textile factory, coming home exhausted and covered in cotton dust. The last thing she wanted to see was her daughter wasting time on what she considered useless knowledge. "What's all this music stuff going to get you?" her mother asked one evening, picking up one of Lily's carefully annotated books about piano technique. "You think some rich family is going to hire you to play pretty songs while they eat dinner? Wake up, Lily. This isn't a fairy tale." The word stung because Lily had actually fantasized about exactly that scenario. She had imagined herself playing background music at elegant parties, or maybe teaching piano lessons to children whose parents could afford such luxuries. But hearing her dreams spoken aloud in her mother's tired, practical voice made them sound foolish and naive. Tommy didn't understand his sister's fascination either, but he was more direct about it. "Why don't you just play the piano at the community center instead of reading about it all the time?" he asked one afternoon while she was practicing finger exercises on the kitchen table. "It's right there. Nobody's stopping you." His innocent question hit harder than their mother's criticism because it went straight to the heart of Lily's fear. She had spent so much time learning about music that the actual act of playing had become impossibly loaded with expectation. What if her hands couldn't do what her mind understood? What if all those hours of study meant nothing when faced with real keys and real sound? There was also the matter of social boundaries that Tommy, at 8 years old, couldn't yet understand. The community center served kids from all over town, including the wealthy neighborhoods on the hill where houses had 3-car garages and swimming pools. Some of these kids took private lessons with teachers who charged more per hour than Lily made in a week at the cafe. The piano might be free to use, but it felt like it belonged to a world that wasn't meant for her. She had overheard conversations between some of the other teenagers about their music lessons, their recitals, their plans to audition for youth orchestras. They spoke casually about concepts that Lily had painstakingly taught herself, throwing around terms like arpeggios and ritardando as if they were common words everyone should know. The gap between their casual familiarity and her desperate self-education felt unbridgeable, but the music in her head wouldn't be silenced. During her breaks at the cafe, Lily would find herself tapping out rhythms on the counter with her fingers. She had memorized dozens of pieces just from watching videos and reading sheet music, carrying entire symphonies around in her mind like a portable concert hall. Sometimes, when she was alone in the apartment and could guarantee no interruptions, she would close her eyes and conduct imaginary orchestras, feeling the sweep of the melodies through her whole body. Her favorite time was late at night after Tommy had fallen asleep and before her mother came home from her evening cleaning job at the office building downtown. Lily would spread her sheet music across the kitchen table and study it under the dim overhead light, following the notes with her finger and hearing the music in her mind. She had trained herself to read music fluently, understanding how the black dots on the page translated into sound and emotion. The internet at the library had opened up a world she never knew existed. She discovered that there were different schools of piano technique, debates about proper posture and hand position that had raged for decades among teachers and students. She learned about the great pianists of history, their rivalries and friendships, their different approaches to the same pieces of music. She felt like an anthropologist studying a fascinating culture from the outside, desperate to join but unsure how to cross the threshold. One evening, while watching a masterclass video featuring a famous pianist working with a student, Lily realized something that changed her perspective entirely. The student in the video was struggling with a passage that Lily had memorized perfectly from the sheet music. She could see exactly where the student was going wrong, could predict what the teacher was going to suggest before he said it. For the first time, she began to believe that maybe all her theoretical knowledge might actually translate into practical skill, but belief and action were two different things. The piano at the community center remained untouched by her hands, a beautiful impossibility that called to her every day. She had convinced herself that she needed to be completely prepared before attempting to play, that anything less than perfection would be a waste of the opportunity. So she continued studying, preparing for a moment that she kept pushing further into the future, always finding one more thing she needed to learn before she would be ready. The irony was that Lily probably knew more about piano playing than many students who had been taking lessons for years. But knowledge without experience remained just that, knowledge, and every day that passed made the gap between what she knew and what she had actually done feel wider and more intimidating. Tuesday evening started like any other. The afternoon rush at Corner Cafe had been particularly busy, with customers lined up out the door during the lunch hour. Lily's feet ached from standing for 6 straight hours, and her uniform smelled like coffee and fried food. But her manager, Tony, had let her leave an hour early because the evening crowd was lighter than expected. Walking toward the community center, Lily felt the familiar weight of her backpack filled with library books about music theory. She had planned to spend the evening helping Tommy with his math homework while her mother worked the late shift at the factory. But when she arrived at their apartment building, she found a note taped to their door in her mother's hurried handwriting. Taking Tommy to doctor appointment, emergency, will be back late. Love, Mom. For a moment, Lily felt worried. Tommy had been complaining about his stomach hurting for the past few days, but their mother had assumed it was just him trying to get out of school. Now it seemed more serious than they had thought. She pulled out her phone, an old model with a cracked screen, and sent a text asking if everything was okay. The response came back quickly. Just precaution. Home by 9, you have evening free, and evening free. Lily couldn't remember the last time she had heard those words. Between work, school, helping with Tommy, and her secret library sessions, every minute of her day was usually accounted for. She stood outside their apartment building, key in hand, trying to decide what to do with this unexpected gift of time. The community center was only a few blocks away, and she found herself walking toward it without really making a conscious decision. The evening air was cool, and the streetlights were just beginning to flicker on as the sun set behind the row of old houses that lined Maple Street. She could hear children playing in a nearby yard and the distant hum of traffic from the main road. When she pushed through the glass doors of the community center, the place felt different than usual. Instead of the typical after-school chaos with kids running around and talking loudly, there was an almost peaceful quiet. The receptionist, an older woman named Betty, who knew everyone in the neighborhood, looked up from her crossword puzzle and smiled. Hey, Lily, you're here late today. Everything okay at home? Yeah, just had some extra time, Lily replied, signing her name on the visitor sheet. Is it okay if I hang out for a while? Of course, sweetheart. There's not much going on tonight. Most of the kids went home for dinner. You've got the place pretty much to yourself. Lily made her way into the main recreation room, and for the first time in all her visits, she found it completely empty. The old gaming console sat silent in one corner, its controllers neatly placed on the table beside it. The battered pool table stood unused, with all the balls racked and waiting. And there, in its usual spot against the far wall, was the piano. She had never seen it like this before, completely alone. No distractions, no other people around to witness whatever might happen. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows made the piano's dark wood surface look warm and inviting. Even the usual sounds from the hallway seemed muffled and distant. Lily approached the piano slowly, as if it might disappear if she moved too quickly. She had imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was actually happening, her heart was beating so fast she could hear it in her ears. Her hands felt sweaty, and she wiped them on her jeans before placing her backpack on a nearby chair. The piano bench was older than the piano itself, its leather seat cracked and worn smooth by years of use. She had sat on it before during her secret practice sessions, but always with the keyboard cover closed, always pretending. Now she stood facing the real possibility of lifting that cover and revealing the keys. Beneath, she thought about all the hours she had spent studying music theory, all the videos she had watched, all the pieces she had memorized without ever hearing them played by her own hands. The Chopin Nocturne was still her favorite. She could see every note of it in her mind, could feel how her fingers should move to create those beautiful flowing melodies, but doubt crept in just as strongly as excitement. What if her mother was right? What if this was all just a fantasy, and she was about to discover that real piano playing was nothing like the theoretical knowledge she had accumulated? What if her fingers couldn't do what her mind understood? What if the music that sounded so perfect in her imagination turned into a jumbled mess when it met reality? She sat down on the bench and placed her hands in her lap, staring at the closed keyboard cover. The room was so quiet she could hear the old building settling around her, the distant hum of the fluorescent lights in the hallway, even the sound of her own breathing. This was her moment, the moment she had been both dreading and anticipating for 3 years. Slowly, carefully, she reached forward and grasped the edge of the keyboard cover. The wood felt smooth under her fingers, worn by countless other hands that had opened this same cover to reveal the keys beneath. She paused, taking a deep breath that seemed to fill not just her lungs but her entire being with possibility. The cover lifted easily, revealing 88 keys that seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Some were slightly yellowed with age, and a few showed tiny chips and scratches that spoke of decades of use. But to Lily, they looked perfect black and white keys arranged in the familiar pattern she had studied in books and seen in videos, but had never touched with the intention of making music. She placed her hands in position over the keys, feeling the cool smoothness of the ivory-colored plastic beneath her fingertips. Her left hand found its place over the lower notes while her right hand hovered over the middle register where most melodies lived. The position felt natural, just as she had imagined it would after all her studying and mental practice. For a long moment, she simply sat there with her hands poised above the keys, feeling the weight of 3 years of dreams pressing down on this single moment. Every piece she had memorized, every technique she had studied, every late night spent reading about music theory had led to this. The piano seemed to be waiting patiently, as if it understood the magnitude of what was about to happen. In her mind, she could hear the opening notes of the Chopin Nocturne as clearly as if someone was playing them in the room with her. She knew exactly which keys to press, exactly how the melody should flow from one note to the next. She had practiced the fingering so many times in her imagination that her muscles seemed to remember the movements even though they had never actually performed them. The room remained perfectly quiet except for the sound of her own heartbeat and breathing. This was it, the moment when all her theoretical knowledge would either transform into real music or crumble into disappointing reality. There was no going back now, no more excuses about not being ready or needing to study more. The piano was here, she was here, and the music was waiting to be born, with a mixture of terror and exhilaration that made her feel more alive than she had ever felt before. Lily pressed down on the first key. The sound that came from the piano was nothing like what Lily had expected. The single note she pressed was clear and pure, but it seemed too loud in the quiet room, almost harsh after years of imagining music in the silence of her mind. Her finger jerked back as if the key had burned her, and she looked around nervously, worried that someone might have heard, but the community center remained empty, and after a moment the sound faded into silence. Lily sat there staring at the key she had pressed, a white one in the middle of the keyboard, and realized she was holding her breath. She forced herself to breathe normally and placed her finger back on the same key, pressing it more gently. This time, the note was softer now, more controlled. It hung in the air for a few seconds before disappearing, leaving behind a feeling that was both satisfying and mysterious. This was it. She was actually making music, even if it was just one note at a time. The piano wasn't just furniture anymore. It was responding to her touch. Turning her intentions into sound, she tried a few more single notes, moving her finger up and down the keyboard to hear how the pitch changed. The higher notes sounded bright and cheerful, while the lower ones felt deep and serious. Each key had its own personality, its own way of speaking when she touched it. This was something she had never been able to experience through all her studying, the physical sensation of creating sound, the way the piano seemed to come alive under her hands. But just as she was starting to feel more comfortable, she heard voices in the hallway. Her hands flew away from the keys as if she had been caught doing something wrong, and she turned toward the door with her heart racing. The voices got closer, and she could make out at least 3 different people talking and laughing as they approached the recreation room. The door swung open, and in walked 3 girls from her high school. Lily recognized them immediately. They were seniors, part of the popular crowd that she had always watched from a distance. The one in front was Isabella Chun, whose father owned the biggest car dealership in town. Behind her were her 2 constant companions, Madison and Grace, daughters of the mayor and the bank president respectively. These were girls who had never spoken to Lily directly, who existed in a completely different social universe despite attending the same school. They wore expensive clothes that looked effortlessly casual, carried phones that were always the latest model, and talked about weekend trips to the city like they were routine occurrences. Lily had served them coffee at the cafe a few times, but they had never really looked at her, treating her more like a piece of equipment than a person. Isabella stopped dead when she saw Lily sitting at the piano. For a moment, there was confusion on her face, as if she couldn't quite process why the girl from the coffee shop was in this space, at this piano, looking like she belonged there. Then recognition dawned, followed immediately by something that looked suspiciously like amusement. "Oh my God," Isabella said, her voice carrying that particular tone that wealthy teenagers used when they found something unexpectedly entertaining. "Look, who's here? It's our little barista, playing dress-up as a musician." Madison giggled, pulling out her phone with the practiced speed of someone who documented everything for social media. "This is too good. Wait until everyone sees this. The girl who can barely afford lunch thinks she's going to be the next great pianist." Grace joined in, her laughter sharp and cutting. "I bet she doesn't even know which end of the piano to sit at. Probably thinks those pedals are for making the music louder or something." The comments hit Lily like physical blows. She felt her face burning with embarrassment and shame, and her hands trembled as she started to stand up from the piano bench. This was exactly what she had been afraid of: being exposed, being laughed at, being reminded of her place in the social hierarchy of their small town. But Isabella wasn't done. She walked closer to the piano, her expression a mixture of curiosity and cruelty that reminded Lily of a cat playing with a mouse. "Come on, don't stop on our account. We'd love to hear what 3 years of watching YouTube videos has taught you about playing piano. I'm sure it's going to be absolutely fascinating." Madison had her phone up and was already recording. "This is going to get so many views. Poor girl thinks she can play piano. It's going to be viral by tomorrow. Everyone's going to love seeing someone finally put in their place." The cruelty in their voices was like nothing Lily had ever experienced directly before. She had overheard mean comments, had seen how these girls treated others they considered beneath them, but she had never been the target herself. The worst part was that they seemed genuinely entertained by her discomfort, as if her embarrassment was a form of free entertainment. Grace pulled out her own phone, apparently not wanting to miss the opportunity to record what they all assumed would be a humiliating failure. "Go ahead," she said with fake encouragement. "Play something for us. We're your audience now. Don't you want to show off all that talent you've been hiding?" Lily's mind went blank. All the pieces she had memorized, all the techniques she had studied, all the music that had lived so vividly in her imagination, everything seemed to disappear under the weight of their mockery. She looked down at the piano keys and couldn't remember a single note of anything she had learned. Her hands felt clumsy and foreign, like they belonged to someone else. The girls were clearly enjoying her distress. They exchanged glances that said they had expected exactly this reaction. The poor girl from the wrong side of town, exposed and humiliated, reminded once again that some dreams were not meant for people like her. Isabella tapped her foot impatiently, as if she was waiting for a show that was taking too long to start. "What's wrong?" Isabella asked with fake concern. "Stage fright?" "Don't worry, we're not expecting much. Just play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star or something at your level. We promise we won't laugh." Much. The laughter that followed felt like it filled the entire room. Lily could feel tears starting to build behind her eyes, and she knew that if she cried in front of them, the humiliation would be complete. They would have their viral video, their proof that people needed to know their place, their entertainment at the expense of someone else's dreams. But something strange happened as she sat there, frozen between the piano and her tormentors. In the midst of all that cruel laughter, she began to hear something else, the memory of music. Not the theories she had studied or the techniques she had memorized, but the pure emotional core of the pieces that had moved her to tears during all those hours at the library. The Chopin Nocturne started playing in her mind, soft and beautiful, and completely untouched by the ugliness surrounding her. It was the same piece that had first captured her heart, the same melody that had sustained her through 3 years of dreaming and studying and hoping. And suddenly she realized that this music belonged to her in a way that had nothing to do with money or social status or the cruel opinions of people who had never had to fight for anything they wanted. Her hands moved toward the keys. Lily's fingers touched the keys, and for a split second, everything in the room seemed to freeze. The 3 girls stopped their chattering, their phones still raised and recording, waiting for what they expected would be an embarrassing disaster. Even the air itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the universe was pausing to witness what was about to unfold. The first note of Chopin's Nocturne emerged from the piano, soft and tentative but unmistakably correct. Lily felt a shock of recognition run through her body. This was the sound she had heard in her mind thousands of times, but now it was real, filling the space around her with actual vibrations and harmony. Her right hand found the melody while her left hand seemed to remember, all by itself, where the accompaniment should begin. The second note followed the first, then the third, each one connecting to form the flowing phrase that had lived in her imagination for so long. But something magical was happening that she hadn't expected. The music wasn't just coming from her memory of sheet music or videos she had watched. It was coming from somewhere deeper, from a place inside her that understood. The emotion behind every note, behind her, she could hear Isabella's voice, sharp with surprise. Wait, what is she actually doing? Is she really playing that? But the voice seemed to come from very far away, as if it belonged to a different world entirely. Lily was somewhere else now, in a place where only the music existed, where her fingers knew exactly what to do without her conscious mind having to direct them. The melody began to soar, and Lily felt her whole body responding to the rhythm and flow of the piece. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing deepened, and her hands moved with a grace she had never experienced before. Years of mental practice, of studying finger positions and hand shapes, of analyzing how great pianists approach this exact piece, suddenly crystallized into physical reality. She could feel the weight of each key beneath her fingers, could sense how much pressure to apply to create the exact dynamic she wanted. When the melody called for a gentle touch, her fingers barely kissed the keys. When it demanded more intensity, she pressed deeper, drawing richer tones from the old piano's worn strings. The instrument responded to her like it had been waiting years for someone who truly understood its voice. The accompaniment in her left hand began to weave around the melody, creating the complex harmonies that made Chopin's music so breathtaking. This was the part she had worried about most during all her theoretical study, coordinating both hands to create independent, musical lines that somehow worked together perfectly. But now it felt as natural as breathing, as if her hands had been having this conversation for years and were finally free to speak aloud. The room's acoustics, which she had never really noticed before, seemed perfect for this moment. The old walls and high ceilings caught the sound and reflected it back, creating a richness and depth that made even this worn-out piano sound like a concert instrument. Every note hung in the air for just the right amount of time before blending into the next, creating phrases that seemed to tell a story without words. As the piece continued, Lily became aware that something had changed in the room behind her. The cruel laughter had stopped completely. She could no longer hear the girls talking or even breathing heavily. Their phones, which had been raised to capture her failure, remained pointed at her, but now they were recording something entirely different from what anyone had expected. The music was building toward the piece's emotional climax, where Chopin had written some of his most beautiful and challenging passages. Lily's right hand climbed higher on the keyboard, playing a melody line that seemed to float above everything else like a bird soaring over a landscape. Her left hand continued its gentle, rolling accompaniment, providing a foundation that was both steady and subtly expressive. But this wasn't just technical accuracy. Something deeper was happening. All the hours Lily had spent listening to different interpretations of this piece, analyzing how various pianists brought their own emotions to the music, had somehow taught her that playing the right notes was only the beginning. The real magic happened when you connected with the feeling behind the music and let that guide your hands. She found herself shaping phrases the way she had heard the great masters do it, adding tiny hesitations and accelerations that made the melody breathe like a living thing. Her touch on the keys varied constantly, sometimes caressing them for a whisper-soft effect, sometimes pressing firmly to make important notes sing out above the rest. These were subtleties she had noticed in recordings but never imagined she would be able to reproduce herself. The piano itself seemed to be responding to her newfound confidence. Notes that had sounded harsh and mechanical when she first touched the keys now flowed together seamlessly. The old instrument was revealing capabilities that had been hidden under years of neglect and casual use. Under Lily's careful touch, it remembered what it had been designed to do, to transform human emotion into sound. As the piece moved through its various sections, Lily felt like she was telling a story that everyone in the room could understand without words. The music spoke of longing and hope, of sadness and beauty intertwined so closely they couldn't be separated. Every phrase seemed to reveal something new about the melody, like turning a crystal in the light to see different facets sparkle behind her. She could sense that more people had entered the room, drawn by the sound of music where there usually was none. But she didn't turn to look, didn't break the spell that had settled over her and the piano. This moment belonged to the music, and she wasn't going to let anything interrupt the conversation she was finally having with this instrument she had dreamed about for so long. Her fingers found the intricate passages that she had studied note by note in the library, but now they flowed effortlessly, as if her hands had played them 1,000 times before. The muscle memory she had built through mental practice was proving itself real and reliable. Every fingering choice she had memorized, every hand position she had analyzed, was paying off in this moment of actual performance. The dynamics of the piece began to build toward a gentle but powerful crescendo. Lily's touch grew more confident, more expressive, drawing sounds from the piano that filled every corner of the room. She could feel the music reaching out to everyone present, pulling them into its emotional world regardless of their intentions or expectations. The melody soared higher, her right hand dancing across the keys with increasing freedom and expression. The accompaniment grew richer and more complex, her left hand creating a foundation that was both supportive and beautiful in its own right. This was chamber music at its finest, multiple voices coming together to create something greater than the sum of its parts. And then, as the piece moved toward its conclusion, Lily felt something she had never experienced before. She wasn't just playing the music anymore. She was becoming part of it. The boundary between herself and the sound dissolved, and for these precious moments, she was simply a conduit through which beauty flowed into the world. The room behind her had become completely silent except for the music. Even the building itself seemed to be listening, as if the old community center recognized that something extraordinary was happening within its walls. This wasn't just a teenager playing piano. This was the birth of a musician, the moment when Years of dreaming and studying transformed into undeniable reality. The final phrases approached, each note precious and perfect. The final note of the nocturne hung in the air like a prayer that didn't want to end. Lily's hands remained poised above the keys, her heart still racing from the intensity of what had just happened. For several seconds, the only sound in the room was the gentle hum of the old building's air conditioning and the distant traffic from the street outside. She had never experienced silence quite like this, not empty silence, but silence that was full of something powerful and unnamed. Slowly, carefully, she lifted her hands from the keyboard and turned around on the piano bench. What she saw behind her made her breath catch in her throat. The three girls who had come in to mock her were standing frozen in place, their phones still recording, but their expressions completely transformed. Isabella's mouth was slightly open, her usual confident smirk replaced by something that looked almost like shock. Madison had lowered her phone without realizing it, staring at Lily as if seeing her for the first time. Grace was blinking rapidly as if trying to process what she had just witnessed, but they weren't alone anymore. Somehow, during her performance, other people had quietly entered the recreation room. Betty, the receptionist, stood in the doorway, with her hand pressed to her heart, tears visible in her eyes. Behind her was Mr. Johnson, the community center's maintenance supervisor, a gruff man in his 60s who Lily had never seen show emotion about anything. He was shaking his head slowly, the way people do when they can't quite believe what they've experienced. Near the back of the room stood an elderly Asian woman that Lily didn't recognize. She was small and elegantly dressed, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that seemed to take in everything. Something about the way she stood, the way she held herself, suggested that music was not foreign to her. She was watching Lily with an intensity that was both intimidating and encouraging. The silence stretched on, for what felt like forever but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. Lily felt exposed and vulnerable, sitting there at the piano, with all these people staring at her. Part of her wanted to run, to escape before anyone could say anything that might break the magic of what had just happened. But another part of her was rooted to the spot, afraid that moving might somehow make the whole experience disappear like a dream. Finally, it was Betty who broke the silence. She started clapping, slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm. The sound echoed off the walls of the recreation room, and it seemed to wake everyone else from their trance. Mr. Johnson joined in, his large hands creating a deep, resonant applause. The elderly woman began clapping too, nodding her approval, with the quiet dignity of someone who understood exactly what she had witnessed. Even more surprising was what happened next. Madison, still looking stunned, began to clap as well. Her applause was tentative at first, as if she wasn't sure it was the right thing to do, but it grew stronger as she continued. Grace followed her friend's lead, though she kept glancing at Isabella as if seeking permission or guidance. Isabella herself remained motionless for a long moment, clearly struggling with emotions she hadn't expected to feel. The applause filled the room, and Lily felt a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the physical exertion of playing. These people weren't clapping because they felt sorry for her or because they wanted to be polite. They were clapping because she had genuinely moved them, because her music had reached across all the barriers of age and social class and economic status to touch something universal in their hearts. Betty wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and walked closer to the piano. "Honey," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I've been working here for 15 years, and I've never heard anything like that. Where on earth did you learn to play like that?" Before Lily could answer, the elderly woman stepped forward. When she spoke, her voice carried the kind of authority that comes from decades of experience and knowledge. That was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, and it was beautifully played. The technique was impressive, but more importantly, the interpretation showed real musical understanding. "Who is your teacher?" Lily felt her face burning again, but this time it wasn't from embarrassment. She was afraid to admit the truth, that she had no teacher, that everything she had just played came from library books and internet videos and 3 years of desperate, passionate self-education. What if they didn't believe her? What if they thought she was lying? I don't have a teacher, she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I taught myself. The elderly woman's eyebrows rose slightly, but her expression wasn't disbelief, it was amazement. You taught yourself? All of it? The technique, the interpretation, the musical phrasing? Lily nodded, still not quite trusting her voice. She expected the woman to laugh or express doubt, but instead, her face broke into a smile that transformed her entire appearance. Remarkable, she said simply. Absolutely remarkable. Mr. Johnson stepped forward, his gruff demeanor softened by what he had just experienced. My daughter took piano lessons for 6 years, he said, shaking his head. Cost me a fortune, and she never sounded half as good as what we just heard. How long have you been working on that piece? About 2 years, Lily replied, finding her voice growing stronger. I found it in a book at the library and just fell in love with it. I've been studying it ever since. Isabella finally seemed to find her voice, though it was very different from the mocking tone she had used earlier. I've been taking lessons since I was 5, she said slowly, as if the words were difficult to get out. My teacher charges $200 an hour, and I've never played anything that sounded like that. How is that even possible? The question hung in the air, and Lily realized that she didn't have a simple answer. How do you explain 3 years of obsession, of studying every detail of a piece until it becomes part of your DNA? How do you describe the way music can call to someone so strongly that they'll find a way to answer, regardless of obstacles or limitations? Madison was looking at her phone, apparently reviewing the video she had recorded. This is incredible, she said, her voice full of wonder. I was going to post this to make fun of you, but this is actually amazing. Would it be okay if I shared this? But like, in a good way? People need to see this. Grace nodded enthusiastically. This is going to go viral, but for all the right reasons. You're incredibly talented. The elderly woman stepped closer to the piano, and Lily could see that her eyes were bright with excitement. My name is Mrs. Chun, she said, extending her hand. I'm a retired piano professor from the State University. I was visiting my granddaughter here, she gestured toward Isabella, and heard the music from the parking lot. I had to come in and see who was playing, Isabella's grandmother. Lily felt a strange sense of the universe rearranging itself. Around this moment, the girl who had come to mock her was related to a piano professor who might be able to help her dreams become reality. Mrs. Chun continued, her voice growing more animated. I haven't heard natural talent like this in years. The way you shaped those phrases, the musical instincts you displayed, these are gifts that can't be taught. They can be developed and refined, but the core of what you have is innate. She paused, studying Lily carefully. Tell me, what are your plans? Are you planning to pursue music seriously? The question hit Lily like a lightning bolt. Plans? She had never dared to make actual plans. Dreams, yes, but plans suggested a level of possibility that had always seemed beyond her reach. Lily stared at Mrs. Chun, trying to process the question about her plans. Plans for music? The idea seemed both thrilling and terrifying. She had spent so long thinking of her musical studies as a secret hobby, something that existed only in the quiet corners of her life. The thought of making it real, of actually pursuing it seriously, felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. I don't know, she said honestly. I've always dreamed about it, but I never thought it was really possible for someone like me. My mom thinks I should focus on practical things like getting a job after high school or maybe learning a trade. Mrs. Chun nodded thoughtfully, as if she had heard this story many times before. Your mother is trying to protect you, which is understandable. But what I just witnessed suggests that you have a gift that shouldn't be ignored. Tell me, how much time do you spend practicing? I assume you have a piano at home. Lily felt her cheeks burning again. I don't have a piano at home. I've never actually played on a real piano before today. Everything I know, I learned from books and videos. I practice finger exercises on tables and desks, and I study sheet music until I can hear it in my head." The room fell silent again. Mrs. Chun's eyes widened, and even Isabella looked shocked. "You mean to tell me," Mrs. Chun said slowly, "that what we just heard was your first time playing on an actual piano?" "Yes, ma'am." Mr. Johnson let out a low whistle. "That's impossible. Nobody plays like that their first time touching a piano. That kind of control, that expression, it takes years to develop." Mrs. Chun was shaking her head in amazement. "In 40 years of teaching, I've never encountered anything like this. The level of musical understanding you demonstrated, the technical control, the artistic interpretation, these things typically require years of hands-on experience with the instrument." Betty stepped closer, her voice filled with excitement. "Honey, this means you're not just talented, you're extraordinary. What you did today, it's like magic." Isabella, who had been quiet since her grandmother's arrival, finally spoke up. Her voice was different now, softer, without the cutting edge it had carried earlier. "I've been playing piano for 12 years, and I've never made music that sounded like that. I don't understand how you did it." Mrs. Chun turned to her granddaughter with a gentle but firm expression. "Isabella, this is what natural musical ability looks like when it's combined with genuine passion and dedication. Your friend here has something that can't be bought or forced. She has music in her soul." The word friend hung in the air between Isabella and Lily. Just 20 minutes ago, they had been on opposite sides of a cruel social divide. Now, something fundamental had shifted. The music had revealed truths that went deeper than money, or social status, or family connections. Madison was still staring at her phone, scrolling through the video she had recorded. "This has already gotten 50 likes, and it's only been online for 5 minutes. People are sharing it like crazy. The comments are all asking who you are and where you learned to play." Grace peered over her shoulder at the phone screen. "Look at this comment. This gave me chills. Who is this girl?" And this one says, "Most beautiful piano playing I've ever heard. Lily, you're going to be famous." The idea of internet fame made Lily feel dizzy. She had always been invisible, someone who blended into the background of other people's lives. The thought of strangers watching her, commenting on her music, felt overwhelming and surreal. Mrs. Chun seemed to sense her discomfort. "Fame isn't what matters here," she said gently. "What matters is nurturing this gift you've been given. Lily, I would like to offer you something. I'm retired from formal teaching, but I would be honored to work with you. Free of charge, of course." The offer hit Lily like a physical blow. Free piano lessons with a university professor? It was beyond anything she had ever dared to dream. "But why?" she asked. "You don't even know me." "I know your music," Mrs. Chun replied simply. "And that tells me everything I need to know about who you are. You have discipline, passion, intelligence, and most importantly, you have that indefinable quality that separates good musicians from great ones. It would be a crime to let that go undeveloped." Mr. Johnson stepped forward, clearing his throat. "If I could make a suggestion," he said. "My brother owns a music store across town. I bet he'd let you practice on his pianos after hours." "I could ask him about it." Nettie clapped her hands together excitedly. "And I could arrange for you to use this piano here anytime you want. I'll make sure you have access even when the center is officially closed." Lily felt tears building in her eyes as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. These people, most of whom had been complete strangers 15 minutes ago, were offering to help her in ways she had never imagined possible. The music had somehow created connections that transcended all the barriers she had thought were permanent. Isabella surprised everyone, including herself, by speaking up. "I could help too. I know I was horrible to you before, and I'm really sorry about that. But my dad has connections in the music world. He sponsors the youth symphony, and he knows people at the conservatory. Maybe I could introduce you." "Mrs. Chun smiled at her granddaughter. "That's very generous, Isabella. I'm proud of you for recognizing something special when you hear it." Madison was typing frantically on her phone. "I'm changing the caption on this video. Instead of making fun, I want to help people find you. Is it okay if I tag the local news station? They love stories like this, hidden talent discovered, dreams coming true. The thought of being on the news made Lily's stomach flip, but she found herself nodding. If her story could help other kids who felt like their dreams were impossible, maybe it would be worth the fear and awkwardness. Grace was looking thoughtful. There are scholarships for talented musicians. My cousin got a full ride to college because of her violin playing. You should definitely look into that. Mrs. Chun nodded enthusiastically. Absolutely. With talent like yours and with proper preparation, you could audition for any music program in the country. The state university has an excellent music department, and I still have connections there. Lily felt like she was standing at the center of a whirlwind of possibilities. Everything she had dreamed about during those long hours at the library, all the futures she had imagined but never dared to believe in, suddenly seemed within reach. It was exciting and terrifying at the same time. I need to call my mom, she said suddenly. She's going to be so shocked. She's always worried about me wasting time on unrealistic dreams, but maybe this changes things. Mrs. Chun reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. Give this to your mother, she said. Ask her to call me. I'd like to speak with her about your future. Sometimes parents need to hear from an expert that their child's dreams aren't unrealistic at all. Betty was wiping away tears again. Honey, I've worked here for 15 years, and this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen happen in this building. You've turned an ordinary Tuesday evening into something magical. The old piano sat silently in the background as if it, too, was absorbing the magnitude of what had just occurred. In the space of 20 minutes, it had transformed from ignored furniture into the instrument of Lily's destiny. The music that had lived only in her imagination for 3 years had finally found its voice, and that voice was changing everything. 6 months later, Lily stood backstage at the town's annual spring festival, her hands trembling slightly as she smoothed down the simple black dress that Mrs. Chun had helped her choose for the occasion. Through the curtains, she could hear the buzz of hundreds of people filling the outdoor amphitheater, more people than she had ever played for before. The festival had been running for 25 years, but this was the first time a local teenager had been invited to perform as the featured musical guest. The journey from that evening at the community center to this moment had been like living in a dream that kept getting more incredible. When her mother had finally arrived home that Tuesday night, she found Lily sitting at their kitchen table with Mrs. Chun's business card, trying to find the words to explain what had happened. Carmen Rodriguez had listened in stunned silence. As her daughter described the evening's events, her expression shifting from disbelief to amazement to something that might have been pride, the phone call between Carmen and Mrs. Chun the next day had lasted over an hour. Lily had sat nearby, catching fragments of the conversation that would change their family's entire trajectory. Words like scholarship potential and extraordinary talent and full university funding floated through their small apartment. Like promises of a different future entirely. Mrs. Chun had been true to her word about the free lessons. Every Saturday morning for the past 6 months, Lily had taken the bus across town to the professor's elegant home where a beautiful grand piano waited in a sunroom filled with plants and sheet music. Those lessons had been unlike anything Lily could have imagined. Mrs. Chun didn't just teach technique, she taught the history behind each piece, the emotions the composers were trying to express, and the way music could tell stories without words. You don't need to learn how to feel the music, Mrs. Chun had told her during their third lesson. As Lily worked through a challenging Beethoven sonata, you already know that. What you need to learn is how to show other people what you're feeling, how to make them feel it too. The piano at the community center had become Lily's daily practice space, thanks to Betty's arrangement for after-hours access. Every evening after work and homework, she would walk the familiar path to Maple Street and spend 2 hours exploring the vast world of classical music that had opened up to her. The old upright piano, once ignored and neglected, had become the heart of her musical education. Mr. Johnson had indeed spoken to his brother about practice opportunities, and twice a week Lily was allowed to play on the newer instruments at Downtown Music Store, The difference between the various pianos had taught her how to adapt her touch and technique to different instruments, a skill that Mrs. Chun said would serve her well in auditions and performances. Isabella had kept her promise about introductions too, though their growing friendship had surprised everyone, including themselves. The girl who had once seemed like an enemy from a different world had become one of Lily's strongest supporters. Isabella's father had indeed introduced Lily to several influential people in the local arts community, opening doors that would have remained closed otherwise. The viral video that Madison had posted had reached over 2 million views, drawing attention from music lovers around the world. Comments poured in from professional musicians, music teachers, and ordinary people who had been moved by the raw emotion in Lily's playing. Several record labels had reached out, though Mrs. Chun advised waiting until after college to consider those opportunities. More importantly, the video had caught the attention of the admissions committee at the State University's Music Conservatory. They had invited Lily for an early audition, waiving the usual application fees and requirements. The audition, which had taken place just 2 weeks ago, had resulted in a full scholarship offer that covered not just tuition but also room, board, and even a stipend for living expenses. Carmen Rodriguez had cried when the acceptance letter arrived, holding her daughter close and whispering apologies for ever doubting her dreams. "I was so afraid you'd get hurt," she had said through her tears. "I thought if you didn't hope for too much, you couldn't be disappointed. I never imagined something like this was really possible for us." Tonight's performance was meant to be a celebration, a way for Lily to give back to the community that had supported her transformation. She had chosen the same Chopin nocturne that had started everything, but she would also be performing a piece she had composed herself, inspired by her journey from the cafe to this stage. Tommy, now 9 years old, was somewhere in the audience with their mother, probably more excited than nervous. He had become his sister's biggest fan, bragging to anyone who would listen that his sister was going to be a famous musician. The pride in his voice whenever he talked about her made Lily's heart swell with joy and determination. As she waited for her cue to take the stage, Lily thought about all the people who had helped make this moment possible. Mrs. Chun was in the audience, having driven down from the university especially for tonight's performance. Betty and Mr. Johnson had front row seats, their faces beaming with the pride of people who had witnessed a miracle. Even Isabella, Madison, and Grace were there, their phones ready to capture and share this next chapter of Lily's story. But perhaps most importantly, Lily herself had changed. The shy, uncertain girl who had been afraid to touch the piano keys had been replaced by a young woman who understood that talent without courage was just potential energy waiting to be released. She had learned that dreams weren't luxuries for people with easy lives. They were necessities for anyone who wanted to transform their circumstances. The festival coordinator appeared beside her, a headset around his neck and a clipboard in his hand. "You're on in 30 seconds, he said with a smile. "The crowd is really excited to hear you play. Are you ready?" Lily took a deep breath and nodded. She was more than ready. As she walked toward the curtain, she could hear the announcer's voice echoing across the amphitheater. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our featured performer, a young woman whose story has inspired our entire community, Lily Rodriguez." The applause was thunderous as she stepped onto the stage. The outdoor piano, a beautiful black grand that had been tuned specifically for this performance, waited for her under the warm spring lights. As she walked toward it, she saw the faces in the crowd, hundreds of people who had come to hear her story told through music. She sat down at the bench and adjusted her position, feeling the familiar weight of her hands above the keys. The amphitheater fell silent, that special kind of quiet that happens when people are ready to be transported somewhere beautiful. Lily closed her eyes for a moment, remembering that terrified teenager who had sat at a different piano 6 months ago, afraid that her dreams were too big for her life. When she opened her eyes and began to play, the music that flowed from her fingers carried all of that journey with it, the fear, the hope, the moment of courage that had changed everything, and the joy of a dream that had finally found its voice. The Chopin Nocturne filled the spring evening with its familiar beauty, but this time it was being played by someone who truly understood what it meant to transform the impossible into reality. As the final notes faded into the night air, the crowd erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. Lily stood and took her bow, looking out at all the faces that had become part of her story. Tomorrow she would start preparing for college, for a future that stretched ahead of her filled with music and possibility. But tonight she was exactly where she belonged, sharing the gift that had always been inside her, waiting for the courage to let it shine.